It's time for the Bible Geek. We don't really know for sure what it is and what it's not. Holy Ghost, God, baby, God blasted on the spot. Ghost, it's time for the Bible Geek.
This is Bob Price, the Bible Geek. Before I get into questions about the Bible, I want to register my great sadness at the news of the passing of the great Leonard Nimoy, a bit of a resurrected savior himself from Star Trek. What an actor, what a character, just really amazing. And just happened and hard to get over. But let's go on to some Bible questions, though. There are plenty of them. And let's see here. I'm sorry I haven't been here doing them that much lately because I've been working furiously on my new book, Holy Fable, the Bible Undistorted by Faith, and I'm really enjoying working on it. I think you're really going to get a kick out of reading it. It's really a lot of fun. Okay, here's one from Norm. Well, a couple from him, actually, which is good. I know young Earth creationists say the world is about 6,000 years old. If I remember correctly, this derives from someone called Archbishop Ussher, who supposedly counted and added up all the ages of Adam, Eve, Seth, Noah, Abraham, etc., to determine that the world was created in 4004 BC. So, adding 4004 plus 2014 CE, we get an age of 6,018 years. However, the Jewish calendar, which I believe also uses Old Testament chronology, lists the current year at 5775. Do you know how the Jews came to this number? Am I correct in my description of Ussher's method? Do you have any idea why there's a discrepancy of 243 years? I'm afraid I do not. That is a tough one. I welcome anybody else's erudition on this, since I ain't got any. But Bishop Ussher, I think he became an archbishop later, not that that matters much, but Bishop Ussher did come up with this date in the manner you mentioned. He figured, well, look, we happen to have pretty strict, specific data of lifespans and so on for the whole range of the Bible characters, and if it's accurate, and of course he thought it was, that should give us this number. And I don't think there are gaps. I don't think he had to wing it. It works pretty well, but of course that's not really there's just no way to accept that if you know a thing about science, but it was a pretty clever maneuver, and of course it didn't seem as stupid then as it does now, and these people were intelligent. If the bishop were not, he couldn't have come up with this, even though of course it's just fantasy. But I would guess that what he did was to at least construct the chronology the Bible writers did have in mind. So that's an achievement. By the way, he didn't have the exact time and day of the week and what month it was. I think it was like 9 a.m. October something or other. That was a subsequent writer. I forget how he managed to fine-tune it that way, but Bishop Ussher, as embarrassing as his theory now seems, at least didn't go that far. Okay, Norm also asks, do any of the extant apocryphal Gospels use Mark and or Q as source materials the way the canonical synoptics do? If so, would this shed any light on the synoptic problem and help resolve doubts about Markan priority of the two-source hypothesis? If not, do you think the Church Fathers deliberately included all of the extant synoptic Gospels in the canon? Regardless of whether or not it was deliberate, it sure makes redaction criticism easier. That is an interesting one. I suppose there are similar theories, I should say similar questions that come up, not exactly what you're asking, which, I think the answer is probably no to, but it's still a good question and does shed a bit of light on the exclusion of the Jewish Christian Gospels, the Gospel according to the Hebrews, the Gospel according to the Nazareans, and the Gospel according to the Ebionites, all of which may well have been different recensions of Matthew, and conceivably earlier, though there's no way to know. But they do appear to be versions of Matthew, and therefore they've sort of inherited the Matthean use of Mark and Q. Let's see, and where this gets even more interesting, though, is the question, as I think Paul Couchot raised many years ago: is Marcion's Gospel one of the synoptics? He has a fascinating essay on how it complicates the source-critical question. If the Marcionite Gospel was not just a kind of proto-Luke, but something a bit more fundamental and shorter than that, and he factors it in, and although I must confess I can't quite remember now what his theory was, but that would be worth looking up. Maybe if I remember past the end of this particular podcast, I'll look it up. But he thought that, that this gospel, which we don't possess anymore, but we can kind of infer what was in it from citations of it by many church fathers, this, he thought, put the whole synoptic thing in a bit of a different light. The Gospel of Thomas raises similar questions because there's the big issue of whether it is to be identified with a Q-like collection of sayings, or if it was another version of Q, a kind of cousin of Q. As some people speak, I think I've got this right, of a Z document, an earlier version of a collection of sayings of Jesus that then became, by expansion, the Gospel of Thomas on the one hand and Q on the other. I tend not to go along with this because it reads more naturally to me, Thomas does, as a collection of wisdom Christology sayings, perhaps the work of the compiler of Thomas, who knows, though, maybe a source that he used, and some probably independent traditions of sayings attributed to Jesus, like the great saying about the jar of meal, plus memory quotes of the synoptics that the compiler had heard in church, but he didn't have a copy to work from, and so I tend not to think Thomas represents an earlier synoptic-like source. Even if it did, I don't think it would be a source used by our New Testament Gospels, but there is some reason to think that it was known to Tatian, or whoever it was, might not have been Tatian, who compiled the Diatessaron, which of course is a kind of mix of all four Gospels of the canon, and people still do this, right? There's one called The Life of Christ in Stereo, and various other ones that are Gospel harmonies, not in the sense of putting the text of the Gospel side by side, which is a very handy tool. Throckmorton and various others have done that, but rather a continuous narrative, trying to put every bit of the Gospels in, and even including the doublets usually, but trying to come up with one continuous, all-inclusive narrative. Stephen Hermann Haller, whose work is just really, as you probably know, very, very fascinating and innovative, he suggests that our Gospels are derived from a kind of mega-gospel, like the Diatessaron. That puts, if that were true, that would put the whole source critical question in a new light. But so that's just really a bunch of random thoughts rather than any kind of respectable answer, but at least those might be pointers and directions you might want to follow up, especially the Couchoud thing. That's Couchoud, Paul Louis Couchoud, Louis Louis. Okay. Paul, who signs himself probably lesser than the biblical, so Paul the Less, not Paul the Great. Let's see, I used to raise goats, and I am left to wonder why the beef with goats compared with sheep. In my experience, they're more or less similar in how they behave, although goats are better escape artists. Both will tend to follow you everywhere, get underfoot, and make a god-awful mess and racket. So what is the significance of dividing, quote, between the sheep and goats, unquote, or are the origins of this lost to history? Or did they just never eat a goat and thus never knew them? I don't know, but my guess is that it's just like that scene you're referring to in Matthew 25. I get the impression it's just a herdsman who wants to count how many he's got, and so segregates the two herds for business purposes, basically. It's not really a value judgment, even in the parable, right? It says that it's like a shepherd separating the sheep from the goats, but in the scenario envisioned here, when the Son of Man comes, he's going to sift out the nations one from another to see who accepted the gospel or not. And so I don't think he's saying, oh yeah, they're like goats because like goats they're evil. I don't think there's any implication of that. It's just sorting them out, and they do that for mundane reasons. Well, in the same way, it's just like the other Matthean parable, where the parable of the dragnet, right? The net captures all sorts of sea life, from minnows to great Cthulhu, and you gotta separate them out when you bring the net in. Some of the stuff you're not even going to keep. I love that commercial. I'm not even sure what it's for now. Is it Gorton's or something, where it's got these foreign fishermen examining their catch, and they're looking into the bucket at the bottom of which the camera is, so we don't see what's in there, but we see their faces looking into it, and they're kind of looking puzzled, and one of them says, "Fish?" Yeah, good enough, and so they toss it in, and you don't know what the heck is in those fish sticks you're heating up, right? I love that. That's kind of what's going on here. Is this really what we want to save and sell, or should we throw it back? Well, that's not any kind of fiendish, insidious thing, but it's a common, mundane case of somebody having to sort out the catch. Well, Matthew says that's what it's going to be like when the angels decide, okay, roll up your sleeves, time to separate the sinners from the righteous. And I think it's just a case of that rather than not liking the goats. Now, you'd have to ask the question, Well, no. How about this? The thing with the scapegoat in Leviticus, what is it, 16? I forget, where two goats are sacrificed, one offered to Yahweh, and the other driven out to the desert where the demons lived, so he can there be eaten by Azazel. Oh, fascinating stuff there. It's interesting. It's not a sheep offered to Yahweh and a goat to Azazel, right? No, goats to both. So apparently they're okay in biblical reckoning, I guess. But I tell you, goats sure make an eerie sound when they're screaming, right? Maybe the writer of the parable in Matthew 25 was thinking of how they sound and figured, yeah, I can imagine the damned in hell sounding like that. Much worse than Goat Boy on Saturday Night Live. Okay, Donovan Ravenhall Willett from Mobile, Alabama. I was wondering if you could address some of the common or more interesting apologetics given for God hardening Pharaoh's heart. It always came across to me as God just showing off what he could do and increasing the suffering of the Egyptian people. Well, yeah, I think that is true, and typically the suffering of the people is negligible to the writer. It's really Pharaoh's fault, and if he'd have listened to reason, he could have spared his people all this, but of course it wasn't really Pharaoh's fault either, was it? Because God hardened his heart. Why does he do that? Well, I think he says pretty clearly, God says to Moses earlier in the story that he's just going to make a punching bag out of Pharaoh, and unfortunately all those poor Egyptians who had no say in the matter. Right? He's going to make it clear that he is the number one God, not the gods of Egypt who are in no position to give Pharaoh any help. He's going to set him up to knock him down over and over again to make his point. I think that is the idea, if I'm correctly interpreting what he says to Moses. So, we could get this done a lot easier and quicker, but that's not good enough. As a friend of mine used to say, well, no, I guess he's quoting Monty Python's The Life of Brian. Crucifixion's too good for him. Right, and that's kind of God's view. He wants to really make a laughing stock, a byword of Pharaoh by really beating the heck out of him. And so that, I think, is the idea there. Because later on you hear all this stuff about how he's doing this for his name's sake, that is to spread his reputation, so that they will know that I am I am Yahweh, the Lord. But the apologetics for it, that I don't know. I mean, how you can defend this, I guess ultimately it's just the old Calvinist thing. Well, God can do whatever the heck he wants. If he wants to do it, it's automatically good, which of course is just absolutely destructive to any belief in objective morality. If it's God's whim, well, then nothing is inherently right or wrong, but I'm guessing that's what it is. I don't see how you can really get out of it. I mean, if you said that it was really up to Pharaoh to listen to Moses' ultimatums, and he wouldn't do it, you could kind of blame him, though it's like the slaughter of the infants at Bethlehem. Whose fault is that? Why punish all these innocent people? You'd still have to ask that, but the fact that it says God made it impossible for the poor jerk to repent and listen to reason, you got your work cut out for you, and I'm not really sure what else they say other than the old divine command theory that God's... what's his name? Meredith Kline, an Old Testament scholar at Gordon Conwell, when I was there, he had this idea that what you were seeing in the slaughter of the Canaanites, for instance, was a kind of proleptic eschatology, that why you complain, and ultimately it would come to this anyway, since these people were all idolaters and perverts. You still have a problem there, right? was it really their fault, and so on. This is the way they were raised, and every one of them, including the babies. It's you can never win on that one. It's just absurd. And I mean, you see what you're doing if you even try to defend that. You're like a spin doctor for a tyrant. Yeah, I know it looks a little awful, but really, Il Duce had a good reason for it. You're sharing the blame. You can't degrade yourself by defending something like that. Okay, thanks, Donovan. And now one from Jordan Smith. He says, what's your opinion of the doctrine of soul sleep? Do you think it's biblical? You know what he means there, right? Seventh-day Adventists and some others believe in this, that there is no inherent immortality to the human soul. If soul is other than a hypostatization of an abstraction, that the nephesh, the man became a living being, a living soul. Nephesh is just the life force, what Aristotle would have called the form of the body, and that once you disintegrate, that's it. You're not holding the form anymore. You don't have the animating nephesh. But God is... Now, I know that kind of runs afoul of the idea of Sheol, where you're not going to heaven or hell, but you still exist in some kind of shadow, ghostly form. But you do have absolute mortalism in the Old Testament too. Like Adam is told, you came from the dust, you're going to return to the dust. That's it. Psalm 90 takes that view, and soul sleep kind of implies that too. But there is a kind of back door out of it, because as God created you to begin with, as the Quran says, He made you from a drop of water, that is semen, to begin with. Why is it any more of a challenge for Him to remake you with the resurrection out of dust? Yeah, okay. So they kind of came up with a way of sneaking in immortality. And but does that mean the whole argument there, like in the Quran, is such to say that you don't have a soul that survives the death of the body? No, it's just that on resurrection morning, you're going to be recreated. And that's why the Quran says you won't have noticed any lapse. You won't have thought that, a lot of time has gone by, finally being dead is over. No, you'll just seem to be waking up as if nothing had happened. Like, well, where am I? Which makes a lot of sense. Well, does the New Testament say this, or does the Bible say this? So let's go on and jump the gun here. Let's read the rest of the question. I know many references in the New Testament refer to the dead being asleep, but so many groups out there, the Catholic Church being one of them, are adamantly opposed to the notion that the dead are unconscious and that they wait for Christ to return to be resurrected in brand spanking new spiritual bodies, and they accept that life after death exists immediately upon the death of the body. I think it's more sound that the people that wrote the epistles believe that the dead are not conscious after the body dies, much in the same way that the ancient Hebrews accepted the notion in their form of the underworld as Sheol. Scripture like 1 Corinthians 15:12 through 18 and 1 Corinthians 15:21 through 22, it seems to me, are very apparent that all hope was hinged on the future resurrection and not life after death, or else what's the point of saying that, if Christ be not raised, your faith is in vain, and ye are yet in your sins, then they also which are fallen asleep in Christ are perished. 1 Corinthians 15:17 through 18. If soul sleep is what the epistles teach, isn't that doctrinal notion just another nail in the coffin for the four Gospels being a historical narrative as well? I mean, Christ ascended to paradise, Luke 24:43, in the Gospel of Luke, but in the other writings he was simply dead, Revelation 1:18, I'm he that liveth but was dead. And that he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, 1 Peter 3:19. What's your take on all of this? Well, I think you do have different opinions in the New Testament about the resurrection, for instance. Luke seems to, or at least whoever wrote Acts, seems to envision a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. Paul is made to confess faith in that, I think, in his trial before the Sanhedrin. And but somewhere in there, yeah, the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked to face the music. The book of Revelation certainly has that. But what about the... okay, let me just pursue that. 1 Corinthians 15 seems to envision only the resurrection of the righteous. Resurrection seems to be the same thing as salvation. They're going to rise, but each in his own order. Christ, the first fruits, the beginning of the process, and then those who belong to him, and then comes the end. Wait a minute, where's the ones that don't belong to him? Where's the wicked? Apparently, they're just left in the grave. So 1 Corinthians 15, yeah, that's it. 1 Thessalonians, I don't want you to be despairing as those who have no hope. Well, that, and then he says, don't worry, Christ is going to come back, and the dead in Christ will rise into the air, and in that mode will always be with the Lord. Well, that's interesting. The resurrection seems to be a spiritual rising, not coming back to the earth. And, of course, only the righteous are in line for that. So there looks to be some kind of heavenly existence at the resurrection, but not a return to physical existence, though admittedly very little is said in detail, so who knows. The epistles speak of those before the resurrection who are asleep, those who sleep. That certainly seems... You'd never use that phrase unless you thought they were just plain dead, but don't worry, they're going to be alive again one day. You wouldn't... you might say their bodies are asleep, but I don't think you'd even say that, right? That seems to me to demand what the soul sleep people say, that they're just gone, but they'll be found again. They'll be recreated. There are, though, New Testament passages that do speak of some sort of incorporeal survival in heaven. However, this is usually said of martyrs in the book of Revelation, for instance. Who is it who we find in heaven with God saying, "How long, O Lord, their souls are under the ark of the covenant in heaven"? Well, that means they were sacrificed. These are the souls of the martyrs. It explicitly says that. Don't worry, it won't be long. We just have to have the full quota of martyrs up here. That doesn't mean that everybody else is in heaven, all other believers who have died. Martyrs, those martyred by the beast, are explicitly said to have an advantageous, privileged position as of the resurrection. When Christ returns, the righteous, the martyrs of the beast will be raised and will reign with Christ for 1,000 years, but only after that will the books be opened and non-martyred Christians and the sinners, only then will they be raised and face the music. Now, where were they? There's no hint in Revelation that the souls of the righteous were with God unless they were martyrs. In Philippians and 2 Corinthians, there are statements implying that Paul figured that when he was shortly to be martyred, that really didn't faze him, because to be absent here would be to be present with Christ in heaven. Now, is that the way it's supposed to be for all of the righteous or all of the Christians? Doesn't say that, right? The point is, he's facing martyrdom. And the Quran, again, makes this explicit, that those who die in battle for Allah, martyrs, they will immediately go to heaven spiritually, but they and everybody else will physically be raised at the last judgment. I think that is what we're glimpsing, though without a great deal of elaboration, in Revelation, Philippians, and 2 Corinthians. There is the notion of the righteous immediately going to paradise, whether they are martyrs or not, in Luke, because that's where the Lazarus, the poor man, in chapter 16, I think it is, winds up when he starves to death one day. He is in the bosom, that is, in the welcoming embrace of Father Abraham. And the rich man who ignored him, he's frying in hell, in Hades, literally, in the fire, the same day, right? So there we have an immediate experience of damnation. Whether Luke thought that either Lazarus or his opposite number would one day rise from the dead, well, that's not really implied in the passage, right? Okay, the wheel is turned. Rich guy, Dives, as they call him, just means the rich man. You had your good things in life. Poor Lazarus didn't. Well, now it's his turn, and it's your turn to suffer. That seems like, that's it. And resurrection from the dead is mentioned, but not as an eschatological thing, right? The rich man, between screams, says, well, tell you what, Father Abraham, at least could you send Lazarus back to warn my brothers who were just as bad as I was? Maybe if he warns them, they'll repent. Okay, it's too late for me. But it's like Marley in A Christmas Carol, right? Too late for him. But he is sent back to warn Scrooge, don't end up like me, because of the way you're going, you will. So that's what the rich man wants Abraham to do, send Lazarus like Marley. But he says, you're kidding yourself. Even if a guy came back from the dead, that wouldn't shake him, because they've already got the warnings of Scripture. And if they're not heeding that, one might say, if they're committed to not heeding that, nothing is going to change their mind, which is quite a wise statement, right? Forget your apologetics for the resurrection. And so it looks like they have reached their final destinations, like those movies, Final Destination, Final Destination 2, 3, 4. How final could it have been? But anyhow, now also in Luke, the crucifixion account, right? The one thief crucified with Jesus tells the other one, mocking Jesus, to shut the heck up. He says, this guy's innocent. We deserve what's happening to us. He doesn't. Why don't you give him a break? And then he says to Jesus, who's, after all, being crucified as the would-be king of the Jews, he says to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, that is, when you're enthroned. And Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. There's multiple layers to this. I think things have been added to that. Originally, remember me when you come into your kingdom, that was mockery. In fact, the same line appears in Diodorus Siculus, where this guy is mocking a slave who claims to be of royal descent. And I think that in the original, Luke had both of them mocking him, just as they do in Mark and Matthew, and specified what the mockery was. Oh, your highness, don't forget about me when you come into your kingly power, right? But then somebody has decided to make this a sincere statement. The guy apparently believes Jesus will come into his kingdom. That seems a little hard to imagine, but he's made into a Christian believer, basically. And Jesus says, Oh, my kingdom? Okay, I'll remember you. You'll be with me. I'm taking you with me when I go to my kingdom of paradise. That's not what the kingdom meant originally. It meant your royal, like James and John, who want to be on Jesus' left and right when he comes into his kingdom, when he comes into his kingly authority, when he takes the throne. But somebody has thought of kingdom of heaven. You mean that place called heaven? And so we've got, this thing has grown in the telling, but the point, at least, is that in one of the levels of it, one of the layers of it, Jesus does speak of simply dying and going to the place where the righteous dead go. Paradise in Jewish thought was the third heaven and the place where the righteous went. And that's presumably where Lazarus was with righteous Abraham. Does that envision a resurrection even for Jesus? I don't think so. So you got all kinds of pointers in different directions, but can you find the soul sleep doctrine in the New Testament? Yeah, I think you can. In other words, I think there are several passages that presuppose that, but there is no one New Testament doctrine. At least, if there were, it'd be mighty surprising if you could come up with one framework that would fit all these pieces into it. By the way, in 1 Peter 3:19, I don't think that was originally referenced to Jesus. I think Edgar Goodspeed was right that, or maybe he got it from somebody else, I forget, but when it says, he's put to death in the flesh and made alive in the spirit, in which also he went to preach to the spirits in prison. There's a scribal error there. In which also is en ho kai in Greek. Originally, it was a reference to Enoch. Jesus was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. Enoch went to preach to the spirits in prison who had been disobedient at the time of Noah. Okay, bingo, that makes perfect sense. And reference to First Enoch. But anyhow, there's my rambling commentary on that one. High Flux 7 says, I've always wondered about Genesis chapter 42, when the 10 sons of Jacob make their appeal to Joseph in verse 16. Make their appeal to Joseph. Verse 16 clearly has Joseph instructing them to send just one from the brothers. Wait a minute. Let me start this again. When the 10 sons of Jacob make their appeal to Joseph in verse 16, he's now a bigwig in Egypt and they don't know who he is. Verse 16 clearly has Joseph instructing to send just one of the brothers back to Canaan to fetch Benjamin in order to prove they are indeed in Egypt to purchase grain and not spies. After 3 days of lockup for all 10 brothers, this suddenly turns into sending all the brothers back except one, Simeon. Any idea what gives? Yeah, just an idea, but there are other equally blatant discrepancies in the Joseph story that must come. Like, who was it that sold him as a slave? The Ishmaelites or the Midianites, etc. Who was it that tried to rescue him? Judah or Reuben, and so on. It's because we have bits and pieces of two different versions that the editor tried to harmonize. He combined them much as the Genesis editor had combined the J and P versions of the flood, for instance, spliced them together. And you can tell he did that because not only is it redundant, it's contradictory. And I think this is best explained that way, that in one version they did send send 9 of these guys back. In one, they sent one back, and obviously that's a pretty easy mistake to make, and I think that's what we have here. The vestiges of two different versions. Like you got Potiphar in one and Potipharah in another version, and playing slightly different roles and so forth. So I think it's a result of the hybrid character of the very long Joseph story. Let's see. Greetings from Waleed in Newcastle, England, across the pond. Whether it be in our weekly, bi-weekly fix of the Bible Geek or the Human Bible, can you please establish a new trend in which you give us parts of the New Testament which are, in your learned opinion, of Gnostic or adoptionistic origins? For instance, that part in Mark where it says, "Today I have begotten you," is obviously adoptionistic, whereas the bit with the "born of a woman" is in answer to the Marcionites, and so on. Well, let me just say right now, I'm sure I'll return to this, those are classic cases. There's Docetist material, at least it kind of looks that way, where in the Gospel of John, Jesus does not need to eat or drink, despite the fact that it says he's hungry, but he turns down the food. And there's the possibility of when he just moves through the crowd about to throw him off the ledge in Luke 4, that he's drifting through the crowd in a non-corporeal way. And there's a couple of other instances that imply perhaps Docetism. Adoptionism, Mark's baptism story is clearly adoptionist. There's no nativity story. And "today I have begotten you," well, that comes from Psalm 2, which was an enthronement liturgy. That was the day on which the new king of Judah was adopted as God's son, and that's where it comes from. And to point out that it's part of the royal enthronement rhetoric is not to make it other than adoptionistic. Oh, that's all it was. What are you talking about? I mean, that underlines the point that, yes, like the old kings, he is adopted in an honorary sense, or what, as God's son from that point on. Just like in the Shepherd of Hermas, for instance. And the fact that the preposition, the Spirit, comes down and enters into him in Mark, and that gets hastily changed by both Matthew and Luke to "rested upon him." Well, Mark has in view this kind of thing you have with Cerinthus and all these others, that there was some sort of entity, an angel, spirit, something that entered into Jesus and made him the channeler for that spirit. I don't see how you can get around that. You have different views in the Epistle to the Hebrews as to whether Jesus was adopted as the Son of God or was a pre-existent divine being. I mean, in the same letter. So there are differences there. And again, that'll come up again and again. It is very interesting to see why the differences, right? The fundamentalist doesn't want to admit there are differences, so his hands are full being a spin doctor trying to iron out the contradictions. I say the critical approach is better because it explains the contradictions. It doesn't deny them. It explains why they contradict and doesn't pretend they don't. And so you wind up understanding it instead of being baffled. The second bit: please convey my greatest gratitude to the gentleman who suggested we use the LibriVox website. He's great. I've downloaded and am listening to the one title you mentioned, which I think was David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus, critically examined. Yeah. Are there any other titles you recommend? There are too many to list here. If you could go to my website, robertmprice.mindvendor.com. I have a higher critical reading list there where I hit a lot of the major works on different aspects of biblical studies, and I think a bunch of the goodies and oldies are listed there. And I'm not familiar enough with LibriVox, but you could use this list and see which ones are on there. That is a great, great tool for sure. Reuben says, my question concerns the Hyksos, you know them, right? Hyksos, and their possible connection to the tribe of Simeon. Earlier this week, fellow Bible geeks, mainly Dale, discussed the historical connection between the expulsion of the Hyksos and the Hebrews. This inspired me to look further into the Hexateuch, the first 6 books, Genesis through Joshua, for signs of the Hyksos. What I found especially interesting is that in Joshua 10:6, the tribe of Simeon is allotted a city by the name of Sharuhen. Rather innocuous, right? Not the case. This is the city that the Hyksos royalty moved to and were ultimately defeated here. So why would this town be included in their territory? Is it possible they are the descendants, the Simeonites, or descendants of the Hyksos? I gotta admit, I draw a blank on this. That's one good way of explaining it, though it seems to me these days that Old Testament scholars don't really think the Hyksos had anything to do with the Hebrews, and that the Hapiru probably didn't either, but I really would have to do some homework I don't have time to do to verify that. You may well be right. Let's see. Okay, one more from Reuven. Concerning the identity of the Amalekites, what no one seems to propose is that the Amalekites' descent from Esau or Edom is an admission that they are of the same stock as the Israelites. Is it possible, then, that the Amalekites simply represent an earlier offshoot of Canaanites, with all the added horrors ascribed to them by the later Israelite writers? Amalekite being a term for any Canaanite-descended person that hadn't become an Israelite? We see, for example, in the book of Judges, chapters 6 to 8, the Amalekites and the Midianites are said to have amassed a visible army of at least 135,000 encamped against Israel. This is not feasible unless these people were living in the land of Israel. You can't very well march an army of that size out of the Sinai or northern Arabia across the Negev, the southern desert, to attack the Israelites. Similarly, the Chronicles author proclaims that the Simeonites have wiped out and supplanted an Amalekite settlement in Seir, is that how you say it, S-E-I-R, the very location where Esau, the alleged forefather of the Edomites, lived. And 500 of these Simeonites, led by Pelatiah, Neriah, Rephaiah, and Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, I-S-H-I, invaded the hill country of Seir. They killed the remaining Amalekites who had escaped, and they have lived there to this day. 1 Chronicles 4:42 through 43. Interesting also that the text there has the sons of Ishi, which could be a reference to Ishbaal, son and heir to King Saul, finishing the job, perhaps? Well, at least I think on the basis of what's come out in the last years that, yeah, the Israelites, the Amalekites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Kryptonites, and all these guys were really ethnically the same. Their languages were cognate, their religions were parallel in so many details that basically they were all the same group. And that the becoming Israelites, you mentioned that, yeah, that by the time we are reading about these guys in the Bible, the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, the Canaanites, were simply the Israelites, and I guess their cousin neighbors, in the days that they practiced the traditional mythical polytheistic religion, and that the Israelites as portrayed in those stories are really people that accept the monotheistic Judaism that came about much later. The Deuteronomic reform, which may be a lot later than we thought anyway, but even if it isn't, even if that was in the 7th century BCE, it's at that point that they begin looking at anybody who sticks by the old religion as a bunch of pagans and Canaanites, and that there's a very thin, easily erasable line between those people. They weren't literally foreigners. They were foreign to the emergent proto-Orthodox Judaism. And so I think it's highly likely that the phenomena you point out in the text with the Amalekites reflects that. Good observation, as always. You're very sharp-eyed, Reuven. Reuven, I know you're a big Star Trek fan, so I especially share my sorrow with you today on the death of the great Captain Spock. Okay, here's another couple of quick ones. Concerning the apparent absurdity of the names of Rachel and Leah, why would Laban name his daughters Little Lamb and Cow? Was he immensely cruel? Or is it like the woman that named her kid I'm a hog? What's the number of Dyfus? Was he immensely cruel, or is this symbolism? Could the tribes descended from the little lamb have offered lamb sacrifices, and the tribes descended from the cow have offered cow sacrifices, or is there some other meaning to the names? Yeah, those names, as Ignaz Goltzier pointed out long ago, refer to cloud formations in all probability. That the weather was very important to the ancient nomads, and the lamb, obviously, the fleeciness and all that, but the cow as well, the rain having to do with the milk and all that. So they're probably names of perhaps divinized, personified weather phenomena. So that'd be my guess. Yeah, let's see. And finally, Commander Scotty from the Ann Arbor Galaxy. Let's see. He teaches in Dearborn. I hope he's watching his back. Okay. In her many books, Margaret Barker talks about the Second Temple and its priests as being corrupt, and that it was the reform of Josiah and doing away with the, quote, religion, unquote, of the first Solomonic temple that introduced this corruption. Could you please elaborate on this? In what way specifically did Josiah's reform corrupt the religion of the first temple? Josiah, of course, is pictured as being king in the time of the first temple. That's that's a little bit different than what your question presupposes. But at any rate, what would be the evidence that the priesthood was corrupted? I wonder if there's not some reference here to the Hasmonean priests who displaced the traditional Zadokite priestly line, because then we've got some data to look at. There does seem to be corruption among the Hasmonean priests and priest kings, like John Hyrcanus. We know about more of the intrigues and the buying of the priestly office and so on. I don't think we're told enough about the Zadokite priests in the wake of the Deuteronomic reform, but there would be a fundamental dishonesty in that the winners rewrote the history after and in light of the Deuteronomic reform. Reform is not really the right word. Let's say the Deuteronomic program. What they did was, of course, as we were just saying in connection with Reuven's question, what they did was to radically alter the Israelite religion from polytheism to monolatry to monotheism. And we see that emerge in the Bible in Jeremiah and in the second Isaiah. And so polytheists were now assumed to have been pagan Canaanites and Israelites whom they seduced into a paganism they knew better than to embrace. Oh yeah, Moses had already taught monotheism. What's that to say? Then how come there were polytheists, as even some Bible stories says? Oh well, that's because they got seduced into it by those damn pagans. And then in light of it, they censored the scriptures to some degree. Luckily for us, leaving a bunch of loose ends so we can figure out what happened. But this kind of propaganda, they fused Yahweh and his father El Elyon together as a single deity and so on. This 1984-like rewriting of history could be construed as as a kind of corruption. Just in the same way we blame the Catholic Church for, and Eusebius and all these guys for fabricating a history of Christianity, which we're only now being able to unravel a bit. I just reread her book, The Gate of Heaven, an amazingly fascinating book about the temple. And I don't recall any more about priestly corruption in there than this idea of changing stuff and pretending nothing had changed, again, just like the Ministry of Truth in the Obama, in 1984. Again, I'll be rereading some more of her books. Boy, Margaret Barker, what a genius. And I'll see if I come up with anything, but nothing else comes to mind. Still, what I've said strikes me as a major instance of religious deception. And you wouldn't have had to say that, right, if they'd have said, we have now, like through some prophet, like the second Isaiah, because a prophet has made it clear, we realize there really only ever was one God, though admittedly people didn't know this previously, but things have become clear. Now, if they'd have said that, there'd have been less of a problem, right? That would have been completely honest. But this rewriting history, that seems dubious, right? It's a step in the wrong direction right out of the gate. Okay, I guess that's it for Bible Geek Matters today. I'll hope this one gets posted soon. I know there's the guys that do this, John and Serjan, have a lot to do, and I'm very, very lucky that they do this at all. But like me, they got other stuff that comes up in their schedule, but pretty soon I'm sure you'll hear this and the other recent ones I've done. Thanks for listening, and I want to thank those of you that have responded to my pathetic appeals for money and to keep the lights on here, and I regret that that's necessary, but you're very kind, and I'll welcome even more, I'm ashamed to say, but have to say. But again, let me emphasize, there's no admission fee for the Bible Geek. If you don't feel inclined to make donations, or you can't, don't think about it again. That's not why I do this, right? It's just loads of fun to do. It's a labor of love. If you can help, great. But if you can't, don't worry about it. And I sure don't. So thank you very much for your interest in the show. And I'll see you soon for another exciting episode.